So we'll get right into it. The agenda for today, so I'll give you a bit of an overview on on-call in general, and then I'll talk to you about our supported living options, and that's certainly the medium-term and long-term options. You'll see there that I haven't included short-term accommodation, and there's a reason for that, which we'll talk through as we go along. We're also going to talk about, tips for getting the best housing outcomes, certainly just what our experience is. We work with participants that access a range of accommodation and have, a range of funding. And our experience is only one experience in the sector, but we would certainly like to share what that is. And then we'll talk through our application and onboarding process. I'll go through our current vacancies with you. And then, as I said, more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so on-call, and I don't say this lightly, we deliver market-leading disability, child, youth, and family services. And that includes a whole range of services, including our supported living, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. It also includes individual support, casual staff services, support coordination, including specialist support coordination. And then we also have our specialist behavior support and out-of-home care. With our supported living options, we provide a range of services across both metropolitan and regional Victoria, and are currently in the process of expanding nationally as well. So accommodation, at On-Call, we keep accommodation simple. I know that, when you, within the sector, when you come across different support providers, quite often the accommodation or housing services that are offered can be quite complex. We know that housing is a complex space as it is. And, when we come across options where there's so many different options or there's so many different boxes that people have to fit into, it can become really, really confusing. So at On-Call, we intentionally keep accommodation simple, and effectively we have one product, which is supported living options, and that's delivered in 2 settings. So we have our medium-term or interim living options, and then we have our long-term or ongoing living options. And I'll talk about those in more detail. So medium-term options. As I said, please feel free to, if you do have any questions, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we will have time at the end. So medium-term options, that's temporary or interim accommodation, and that can be provided in a range of different environments. So that can include properties that On-Call has leased. It can also be specialist disability accommodation where, rather than using it for a longer term option, we maintain that specifically for medium-term accommodation. And I'll refer to it as MTA moving forward. It can also be provided in a hotel or other environments. There are no limits to where it can be provided. We certainly aim to tailor the accommodation depending on the person's needs. So MTA, we know, is a pathway to longer term accommodation. So quite often people will come to us requiring MTA because they're either waiting for their longer term accommodation to become available, or they don't yet have that option. And while they're sourcing or securing that option, they need that interim solution. So we do have various MTA options available in different locations across metropolitan and regional Victoria, as I said, and that depends on what a person's accessibility requirements are and what their support needs are. So, and I'll give you an example. Quite often someone might come in needing MTA. However, we know that because of their physical disability, they need a property that's high physical support. So while they're waiting for their high physical support SDA option to become available, we know that the MTA that we offer them still has to meet those access requirements. And that's why quite often where we do have these properties with different access requirements, there is a lot of assessment that happens in trying to make sure that the person, the property is the best fit for that person. So MTA typically is time limited. Usually that's 90 days, although we know that quite often under extenuating circumstances, it can be up to 180 days. We also need evidence of a long-term housing option. So in order for the NDIA to fund MTA, we know that they need to know that at the end of that period, whether it's the 90 days or it's the 180 days, that participant has a long-term housing option to go to. And usually with the housing options, the evidence that's required by the NDIA is in the form of a conditional letter of offer, whether that's a letter of offer from the SDA provider that's building a property for the person, or it might be from a different property owner. There needs to be an offer of support with a specific date so that the NDIA knows how long they need to fund that MTA for. So in terms of funding itself, it's funded out of a core budget, specifically as that stated MTA support. And the MTA funding covers the cost of the accommodation only. So it covers the property, however, it doesn't cover the actual support. So if we're providing MTA support, then the participant needs to have both the MTA funding as well as funding for the staffing out of their core budgets. Now, usually that's out of the assistance with daily living budgets, and the staff support will vary depending on the person's support needs. But it's just really important to distinguish that there are two different funding options there. So the MTA for the property, and then of course the funding for the staff support. It does not include food or utilities, medication, activities, or any other day-to-day costs. So really important to understand that those costs would be out of pocket. And when we're talking to participants about what that looks like, we have those conversations and provide a breakdown of exactly what that is. Now, before I talk about the long-term options, as I said, you'll note that we haven't included short-term accommodation options. And that's because On-Call typically doesn't provide short-term accommodation. We can assess on a case-by-case basis if someone needs emergency accommodation and the only funding that they have available is their short-term accommodation funding. We will absolutely assess how we can assist, but in terms of the options that we provide, it's typically that medium-term and longer-term option. Okay, so before I go into the long-term options, does anyone have any questions or any comments? No? Fantastic. Okay, so long-term options, there are two different things that we need to focus on. In terms of the property where long-term options can be provided, so that can be either in specialist disability accommodation, which is our SDA, or it can be in non-SDA. So when I talk about non-SDA, that can range from your mainstream housing. So it can be a private rental, it can be social housing, it can be in a family-owned home, it might be in a property that's head leased by Oncall, as an example. So there's certainly different options. But in terms of the broad categories, we look at either in SDA or in non-SDA. And then in terms of the support itself, that is delivered out of a person's NDIS core funding. So assistance with daily life budgets. Now, typically that can be either, supported independent living, so SIL as the stated support, or it can be just flexibly out of a person's core budget. So in terms of supported living in SDA, there are a few things that need to be considered. So a participant would definitely need SDA funding for their capital, which is separate to their SIL or staff and supports. We know that there are different design categories and building types, and I won't focus on those, but certainly happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. However, of course, the person has to be assessed for the specific design category and building type that they need. And I will talk about that in a little bit more detail down the track. SDA can be either custom built or ready to occupy. And by that, what I mean is, a participant can apply for an SDA property that's already in development, or it's already completed and ready for them to move in. So as long as the SDA funding that they're approved for aligns with that property, then they can be considered for that option. Or in the very early stages, we link participants in with the SDA provider, and the SDA provider then looks at a custom builds depending on their individual needs. So it might be a custom build for them to live alone, or it might be custom build with other people as well, depending on what they're approved for, what their needs are. And again, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So what happens then is Oncall, as the SIL provider, will partner with SDA providers, and we have a range of SDA providers. We are very specific and very particular about who we partner with. It's not about quantity. It's very much about making sure that the values and the vision and the goals of the SDA provider align with Oncall's as well. So we go through quite an intensive process to identify which SDA providers we want to partner with, and we then work with them to develop the properties. So quite often when we partner with an SDA provider, we might already have specific participants that we have in mind in terms of what those builds are, or depending on what we know that the demand is, we'll work with them to develop properties, and then we identify participants to move into those as the build goes on. So again, in addition to the SDA funding that a participant needs, they also need the assistance with daily life funding for the staff and support. So anyone living in SDA, they need the SDA funding for the capital, and then they need the assistance with daily life for the staff support. So two very different things. And in terms of what's needed to secure those, again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Participants can, of course, have the option to live alone or with others, but that's very much dependent on the funding available, what their preferences are, and what their support needs are. So that assessment by the NDIA in terms of, whether a person needs to live alone in a sole occupancy property for one reason or the other, or they can share with 2 or 3 or 4 other people. All of those factors are taken into consideration when determining the right place for them to live. So in terms of the, so again, going back to the relationship with the SDA provider, Oncall is certainly in that relationship. We're the SIL provider, and I'll use the word SIL because it's widely recognized when I talk about with the supported living options or the SIL provider. So we're providing the staff and support, and we're partnering with the SDA provider who's providing the actual physical property. So what happens then is we enter into the collaboration agreement, and a collaboration agreement has to be entered into with each different SDA provider that we have. And that collaboration agreement talks about obviously the rights and the responsibilities of the SIL provider, the SDA provider, how each of us will work to support the participants to live within that property. And it talks about things like maintenance, ongoing support provided to the participants, conflict resolution, a whole range of things. And that's very much the overarching agreement that forms a relationship between the SDA and the SIL provider. So that's the first agreement in place. And again, that might happen quite early in the stage, even before participants have been identified, or it might happen as we provide referrals to different SDA providers. So the SDA provider will then have their own agreements with the participants. Now, in terms of that agreement, it can be one of two things, and that's in line with the Consumer Affairs Victoria agreement. So it'll either be the SDA residency agreements or it'll be the residential rental agreements. And we know that there are different advantages and disadvantages for each of those. Certainly the SDA residency agreement provides more protection for participants. However, in terms of which agreement is entered into, that's very much a decision for the participant and the SDA provider. And typically, Oncall as the SIL provider would not necessarily be part of that process. We help with trying to identify what's the best one for a participant, depending on the situation. And we also know, of course, that with residential rental agreements, a participant needs to actually be able to enter into the agreement rather than being able to establish an agreement. So the key difference there is that they need to be able to understand the agreement and sign it themselves. Whereas with the SDA residency agreement, there is an option there to either enter into it or to simply establish it. So establishing the agreement is where the participant may not have the capacity to understand or sign the agreement. And so, a process is followed, of course, and then the SDA provider establishes the agreement with the person, having acknowledged that they've provided the information, they've given the participant and their nominated person time to read through and understand, and then it's established without the participant physically signing it. So there are there's certainly different advantages. And again, as a SIL provider, Oncall would not recommend or dictate one agreement or the other. That is very much between the SDA provider and the participant. So Oncall would then enter into separately a service agreement with the participants, and that's then outlined in the supports that will be provided from a SIL perspective. It provides a breakdown of the agreed supports, what the roster might look like, rights and responsibilities, how to end supports, all of those typical things that you find in a service agreement. And then as an addendum to that, we then have residential fees and charges. So we know that NDIS funding doesn't cover day-to-day costs. So things like your rent, the cost of utilities, food, if there are personal expenses that Oncall needs to support a participant with, all of those things would be clearly laid out in a residential fees and charges agreement. And that then forms part of the service agreement. So effectively it means, and it's a lot of information, it's a lot of agreements, but effectively the SDA provider and Oncall as a SIL provider have a collaboration agreement. The SDA provider then has a residency agreement with the participant, and then Oncall has a service agreement with the participant as well. And all of those agreements needs to complement each other, obviously. Before I know that space can be quite complex, just before I move on from that, does anyone have any comments or thoughts or questions? No? Fantastic.
Yeah, sorry, Kat. For SIL funding, usually rent is not included, is that right?
That's right. So SIL funding only covers the cost of the staff support.
We may have some participants with SIL funding who want to live on their houses and SIL provider can provide the services.
That's right. Yes, and we have those arrangements in place at the moment with a lot of participants. So as I was saying before, SIL can be provided in essentially any environment. So if it's being provided in the participant's own home, then of course they wouldn't be paying rent or any of that because it's their property. And as we go on, you'll see that reflected as well. So the participant would only be paying rent if they're living in either an SDA property, or if it's a non-SDA property where there's an agreement in place with Oncall. So for instance, quite often we have head leases. So we might lease a property specifically for a participant. So Oncall would have a head lease, and it means then that we would charge rent to a participant. And with rent and board charges, that is always in line with that's always a percentage of a person's pension. So whether they're in an SDA accommodation or they're in non-SDA where they have to pay rent, it's always a percentage which is up to 25% of their pension plus 100% of the Commonwealth rent assistance. So depending on what the circumstances are, yes, a person would absolutely need to pay rent, which isn't covered by their SIL funding. Or if they're in their own property, family-owned property, whatever it might be, then of course they're not paying rent or utilities or any of that because they manage that quite separately.
So SIL participant can have both SIL and SDA, where they will get assistance for the rent and the support. Is that right?
So a SIL participant can have both SIL and SDA funding. Yes, absolutely. And typically a person with a disability should always be receiving a disability support pension. So the rent will never be covered out of a person's NDIS funding. It means that it's considered out of pocket, but it's a percentage of their pension. So for most situations, unless a person is living in their own home, for most situations, they will still need to pay rent, which comes out of their pension. So from the NDIS, they get the SDA funding and they get the SIL funding, but the rent is out of pocket.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I've talked about the supported living in SDA and just gone through what the agreements would be in SDA. And now we just want to talk briefly about supported living in non-SDA. So as I said, a person receiving SIL support can live in, it's really one of two options, SDA or non-SDA. And most of the, I'll say conditions, for lack of a better term, are the same. The only difference with a person living in non-SDA is that they don't need to have the SDA funding. So they don't need to be funded for SDA through the NDIA. Now, whether a person lives in SDA or non-SDA is dependent on a couple of things. So it might be preference, but one of the most important things is the assessment by the NDIA of whether they're actually eligible or not. We know that not everyone is eligible to live in SDA. A person needs to have very high support needs or physical disability that impacts on them enough that they need very specific modifications to the property, to put it one way. So if a person has been assessed and they're not eligible for SDA, that's often when they will come to us to look at a non-SDA option. However, I will make a note, of course, that someone might have been assessed for SDA, but they may still choose, for one reason or the other, to actually explore a non-SDA option. We've certainly had those situations. They're unusual, but they do happen. So non-SDA, again, in terms of the staff and support, quite often it's very similar to what would be in SDA. The difference here is the environment itself. So support can be provided in various environments. So that can be, again, things like private rentals, family-owned homes, social housing, or an on-call property. And when I talk about an on-call property, that's what I was referencing before, where on-call would head lease a property, whether it's for one person or it might be for a group of people. So we might head lease a 4-bedroomed home, just effectively your typical mainstream home. We'll enter into a head lease, and then we'll then support 3 people in that home, with the 4th bedroom being used as the on-site overnight assistance or the staff office. So those situations certainly happen often enough. Alternatively, someone might come to us requesting the SIL support, but they've already got a property identified. So it might be, the participant has a unit at the back of mom and dad's house, or it might be that they own their own property. So we don't need to support them to find a property. It's just about us being able to organize the staff and support within that. Quite often, we might have someone that, they own a 3-bedroom house, for example, and they want on call to support them, but they also want us to help find someone for them to share with. So they would then lease the 2nd bedroom to another person, and we help with being able to identify and match that person. So I think the biggest takeaway is, there are so many different options. There are so many different scenarios that we often encounter. And, it's about working with the participants to identify, okay, what is it that you need? Do you need us to support you find the property and then put in the staff support? Or do you already have a property and you just need us to provide the staff support within that? And we work with each person, assess what their needs are, and then we go from there. So within that non-SDA environment, of course, as I said, SDA funding wouldn't be required, but the person would need assistance with daily life funding in their core budget for the actual staff support. And that might be either, again, it might be SIL, so the stated SIL support, or it might just be, flexible core supports used, a few hours a day here and there. Whether it's an SDA or non-SDA, there isn't a blanket response to whether someone is supported under SIL or not. It very much depends on what their needs are. We know that SIL is typically funded by the NDIA in shared environments, even though it can be funded for a person to live alone. Our experience is very much that it's more likely to be funded as SIL if you're sharing with at least one other person. If you're living on your own, more likely than not, again, our experience is that it will just be funded out of a person's core budget for them to use flexibly. In determining, again, which option we go with, we very much look at what the person's housing assessment or OT report says as well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. If we are going to do a SIL submission, then OnCall would develop that SIL submission as the SIL provider, and that's done in consultation with the participants. It's done in consultation with the support coordinator, the allied health practitioners, particularly the occupational therapists. So it's us understanding exactly what the supports are, and from that, being able to then develop a roster of care that matches the person's support needs, And we then, complete the SIL tool and send that through to the NDIA. And of course, we know that before we can submit before we can complete any SIL submissions, we absolutely have to have the endorsement of the participant. So quite often what will happen is, we'll have discussions with the participant and their care team. We'll draft up the roster of care and the submission. We'll send that back to the participants, usually via the support coordinator, and say, from our assessments, this is what we think your roster of care should look like. And then, have that discussion with the participant about, okay, does that meet the needs? Does it need to be tweaked? Can they do with less supports here, or do they need more supports there? Whatever it is, it's very much a consultative process until we come up with a roster that absolutely meets needs, but is also financially sustainable. So, it's about making sure that things are reasonable and necessary. And then we submit that through to the NDIA. If the decision is that it won't be a SIL submission that's done, and instead the request will be for core supports, just flexible core supports out of a person's budget, we still go through a fairly similar process, except it means that we're not using the NDIS SIL tool. We would just provide a service cost estimate for what the supports that the person needs. So, the processes are fairly similar. It's really more about the templates that are being used and how that's submitted to the NDIA. Okay. So again, in the same way that we had the agreements for a person living in SDA, if they're living in non-SDA, we'd still need to have agreements in place. The difference here is that because there isn't an SDA provider involved, we wouldn't have a collaboration agreement with an SDA provider. And it also means, of course, that the participant wouldn't have their own agreement with the SDA provider. So there are 3 agreements that would potentially be in place in this instance. The first is the on-call service agreement. Again, outlining the supports that will be provided, rights and responsibilities, all of those really key things. We would still also have the residential fees and charges agreement, because again, whether you're in SDA or non-SDA, typically there's rent and utility and food costs associated, unless you're living in your own home, like we talked about. And then lastly, if it's in an on-call property, then we would also have a residential rental agreement. And that's the standard CAV agreements. So, if someone is coming into a property that we've head leased, then it means we need to have an agreement that talks about the supports that we're providing, which is your service agreement. But we also need to have an agreement in terms of what their tenancy rights are. So it's really, really critical for us that those 2 things are absolutely separated, so that we can, in the same way that SDA and SIL provision have been separated, it means that there isn't a conflict of interest, and we can clearly articulate what the rights and responsibilities are with each of those things. And then if there's conflict, or if a participant has a complaint, they've got very, very clear processes for how that's managed. Okay, so any questions about that before I move on? Okay, so now I just want to talk about some tips for getting the best housing outcomes. And certainly this is just from what our experience is. There are, I think it's safe to say that there are a lot of things that you can do when when supporting a participant to get the right funding, but also when supporting them to secure a property. These tips are not exhaustive. It's really just the key things that we find as we interact with, in particular, support coordinators and allied health practitioners, and where we see that, if funding comes back less than what was expected, the key things that we see that can sometimes contribute to that. So first of all, in terms of tips to help maximize the funding that a person gets in their NDIS plan, and again, hopefully, a lot of this will be really obvious for most people in the room. However, as I said, unfortunately, we do see time and time again, some of these things start to crop up. So one of the really, really key things is obviously having a detailed housing assessment and subsequently an OT report completed by a qualified health practitioner. And usually that's your occupational therapist. I cannot stress just how critical the OT reports are, both for getting SDA funding and for getting the right level of assistance with daily living funding. The OT reports are the most critical evidence that the NDA will refer to. So when I say detailed, making sure not just that we've got an OT report, but that it actually covers the things that it needs to. And I'll talk about that report specifically in a moment. So then also, in addition to the OT report, providing as much additional evidence as possible of a person's support needs. When I talk about other evidence, so this is things like, if there are other reports or plans, of course, your behavior support plans, but it's also things like, your multidisciplinary team reports, particularly for participants that are stuck in hospital. So we, a large component of the people that we support or applications for housing come through from people that are stuck in hospital where there's no clinical indication for them to be in hospital. There might have been at one point, and they've gone in, for treatment for something, and then they don't have secure housing to be discharged to. So you find that the person's been stuck in hospital for 3 months or, up to a couple of years sometimes, simply because they don't have that, housing. So as in those settings in particular, it's really, really beneficial to have the multidisciplinary team reports because they provide, they really, really strongly supplement anything provided by the OT. And it's really that very holistic overview of what a person's needs are. But it also talks about, okay, in that setting, what level of support has the person needed? What are the key things? What are the health issues as related to the disability issues and all of those things? If there are incident reports, if a person requires a higher level of support because there are behaviors of concern, then the first question would be, okay, where is the evidence? Where are the incident reports? So you might want to compile, the last 6 months worth of data or the last 3 months worth of data, or even if it's just a couple of really key incident reports that talk about things. Being able to really, really clearly evidence that. Okay, so before I go on, I've just got a question there about what are multidisciplinary reports. So multidisciplinary team reports are typically provided in hospital environments. So where someone is stuck in hospital, they'll have a whole care team around them. So that will include, of course, their treating doctors, their nursing support. Usually there's social workers involved. There might be occupational therapy, might be physiotherapy. So all of those people involved in the care team, they're referred to as the multidisciplinary team. And in most hospitals, they will usually do a multidisciplinary team report, which is just a really comprehensive report about each of those areas. So it talks about, the reason why the person went into hospital, first of all, what their current health status is, whether there's a clinical indication for them to be in hospital. And then it talks about what their support needs are, in relation to, personal care. It might be behavior support, it might be mental health support. What if they were to be discharged into the community, would they need nursing support? All of those things. So it's effectively all of the different disciplines within the care team providing that breakdown of those support needs. And they're really comprehensive, and those, as I said, again, in addition to the OT reports, they are really, really strong evidence from the NDIA about what the person needs, not just in that clinical setting, but also if they were to be discharged into the community, what that would look like or what that should look like. So if you are supporting any participants that are stuck in hospital, absolutely recommends that you request a multidisciplinary report or an MDT report from usually via the social worker. Okay, so the other thing as well, again, I'd like to think fairly obvious, but making sure that you understand the level of social and community participation that a person needs. So, quite often when we get applications for housing, it's not clear enough what assistance with daily activities or assistance with daily life a participant needs, and then what assistance with social and community participation they need as well. They're two very different things, and they're funded differently. So it's really important to be able to articulate what that looks like. And even if, quite often, again, when I go back to a participant stuck in hospital, if someone's been in hospital for a year, it's very hard to turn around and say, well, they're going to need this many hours of social and community participation. The reality is you probably just don't know, but it's okay to provide an informed estimate, I suppose, of what that might look like. So it might be based on what they were previously accessing before they went into hospital, or it might simply be based on what their goals are, or what they're hoping to achieve. So if someone's been in hospital for a year, it's reasonable to say, due to the fact that they've been in hospital, it's unclear what their social and community participation will look like once they're discharged. However, it's anticipated that they will need support from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., 7 days a week, or from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m., 5 days a week, whatever it might be, just being really, really clear on what that can look like, because that information also then goes into the SIL submissions that we do, or if we're providing just a service cost estimate, again, we reflect that information in there. Now, if someone is moving into, if Oncall is going to be providing SIL supports to a person, that's certainly only one of the services that we can provide. We can also provide the social and community participation. We certainly don't have to, and we absolutely encourage that participants have access to a range of providers. So whether Oncall is providing the social and community participation or not, regardless, it's really important that you're able to articulate what that breakdown looks like, what days and times the person would expect to need that participation. Okay, so the other really critical thing, making sure that the information in the OT report and the information that's provided in the NDIA request for home and living supports form absolutely align. So hopefully everyone that's here today is familiar with the request for home and living supports form. That's typically the trigger process for the NDIA to assess what supports a person needs in a home environment. So, it's quite a comprehensive form, and it asks about, the person's current living arrangements, the supports that they're currently receiving, what supports they anticipate they'll need to receive in a new environment, all of those things. So it's really detailed, and because that form can be completed by the participants or a nominee that they choose, what we find quite often is that there's a mismatch between what's included there and what's in the OT reports. So then when those two things are submitted to the NDIA, that's where we see then that, funding doesn't quite meet a person's needs because there's conflict in information. So I would imagine typically the support coordinator support coordinator would be coordinating, completion of that form in the same way they're coordinating, the OT assessments and the OT reports. So really, really critical before those things are submitted, making sure that the information aligns. Where there is a conflict, the OT reports will quite often take precedence because that's the formal assessment by a qualified practitioner. But it can create issues if there is that mismatch. And if anyone needs a link to the request for home and living supports form or any other information, we're certainly happy to provide that. So then lastly, when scheduling a plan review, making sure that that happens in a way that it aligns with both the OT report being ready, as well as the SIL submission being ready. So, quite often what will happen, and, I'll talk about our application process, but quite often what will happen is someone will apply for a property with Oncall. And, once we go through that process and we do the SIL submissions, at that point, you would be triggering a plan review because the funding that's in a person's current plan is unlikely to actually meet their needs in their new home environment. So if you trigger that plan review too early, it might be that the OT reports aren't available, or it might be that the support provider on call hasn't done the SIL submission. So really important for there to be that collaboration. So we make sure that when the plan review is triggered, you've got all of the support and information that you need. You've got the OT report. That we've done the SIL submissions, which the SIL submissions, of course, go to the dedicated SIL team within the NDIA. So those wouldn't be part of the plan review discussions. But when you have the plan review meetings for a person, the planner needs to be able to confirm that the SIL submission has gone through and it's sitting with the SIL team. So it's that really clear alignment. Again, something quite often we'll see either funding not coming through at the right level or plans being delayed just because the timing hasn't been quite right. So that's something that can have an impact. Okay, so then in terms of, tips for being able to, so the first part is making sure that we're trying to maximize the funding for a person. And then the second part of that is, trying to secure the right property and making sure that it's a right fit. And really just a couple of key tips. And again, these are, I'd like to hope fairly obvious, but the impact can be so significant. So making sure that when you do submit an application, whether it's with Oncall or it's with another support provider, you've gone onto the housing hub, you've seen a property that you like, and then you've put in an application. Really important that you provide all the information about the person. We need the assessments that we do to understand a person's support needs, but also to identify a suitable property, all of those things. Those assessments have to be based on the right information being provided. And if we don't get the right information or information is held back, then it means we're setting the person up to fail, or we're going to identify a property that might not actually meet their needs. And we know, particularly when we get applications directly from participants or their carers, it might be mom or dad, I think quite often, especially where there might be behaviors of concern or something similar, the person applying might not give us all of the information because they think it means that we won't provide a service, or we'll knock a person back effectively. And as I said, the impact of that can be really, really critical. Because if we don't know about a person's behaviors of concern, or if we don't know that a person reacts a certain way to, other people, then once we then confirm a property or put supports in place, that can then create a whole range of issues for them. So can't stress it enough, better that we know everything and we can then be absolutely clear on what controls need to be in place to mitigate any risks. We're really clear on what that roster should look like. We're really clear on what a property should look like, and go from there. So, and then again, being open and transparent with the support provider. So just building on from that, better that we have a really, really open discussion about what the key issues are and what needs to be in place than the alternative. And then just last little tip there is making sure that there's a plan in place for all the other supports that a person will need in their new home. And by that, I mean things like, in particular, health supports. So, you know, if a person has applied for a property, we've gone through a process, they've got the funding that they need for their SIL and their SDA, whatever it might be, and then they move into the home, there might be things that they need within that new home that aren't actually part of the service offerings from Oncall or the service offering from any disability support provider. So if a person needs, you know, if they have a stoma and they need nursing supports for that, the support workers would be providing day-to-day support, you know, in line with the health management plan. But in terms of that actual health support, you know, being able to change a catheter every 6 weeks, that's not something that a support worker would be doing. That's very much a health support. So particularly with support coordinators, making sure that you've done that assessment of everything else that the person would need. And it goes back to that multidisciplinary approach. You know, disability support might only be one aspect. So it's about understanding all the other things that are needed and making sure there's a plan in place to be able to implement those things. Okay, so as I said, I just wanted to talk about the OT reports in a little bit more detail because I cannot stress enough just how critical they are. I think everyone's experience has probably been the same in that having an OT report that has the right detail and is articulated correctly can be the absolute difference between a person being assessed as eligible for SDA, but also for them being able to get the level of staff support that they need. So just some really key things that we have been seeing and we continue to see over time. Within the OT reports, if a person has been assessed as needing SDA, it's really, really important to articulate not just what design category they need, but also the building type and the location. A large percentage of the OT reports that we see will often have just the design category, but it won't go into the building types and locations. And we know that, you know, the difference between a person needing a robust home that can live with 2 other people is very, very different to a person needing a robust home where they absolutely cannot live with anyone else because of the sheer nature of their behaviors of concern. It is, you know, it's such a huge issue. So the OT, when they do the assessments, needs to be very clear about what is the design category? Does the person need improved livability, fully accessible, high physical support, or robust? But further to that, do they need to live alone? Can they live with others? If they can live with others, reasonably, how many other people can they live with? If they can't live with others, what's the justification? What are the issues? So really clearly laying those out. What sort of building do they need? Can they live in an apartment or does it have to be a house because, you know, they cannot have any interface with other people, you know, all of those things. And then of course, location as well. So the location factor has a really big impact on the level of SDA funding. Now, the location factor can be flexible in that if someone is approved for one location, putting in a request to the NDIA to then change that for one reason or the other. Our experience is that that can happen without too much issue. However, it can also be an uphill battle. So really important to try and get the location factor right from the get-go. If a person lives in the southeastern suburbs and that is where their community is and that is where all of their connections are, then it's really important to articulate that. And that's justification enough of where they should be living. If they currently live in the inner east, same thing. So just really important to articulate. And then having a clear breakdown of the staff support that's needed over a 24-hour period. Again, quite often we'll see OT reports that have really, really good content about, the person's support needs, what areas they need support and what that needs to look like, the physical building, all of those things. But it doesn't actually have a breakdown of what the staff support should look like over a 24-hour period. So it becomes a little bit of, professional judgment, and it can be quite subjective. I can read an OT report and my assessment of what level of support a person needs can be quite different to the next person reading that report. So to avoid any sort of ambiguity, it should really have a breakdown. And I can't stress enough, tables are ideal. Really clear what a typical day looks like and what a typical week looks like. So if they need overnight support, is that inactive overnight support or does it have to be an active night? What's the ratio of support? And then through the day, from the moment they wake up right till they typically go to bed at night, what does that support need to look like? Where will they have the social and community participation? What's a reasonable ratio of support over each of those periods? Having it very, very clearly broken down means that myself as a layperson won't make my own assessment, but also the person in the NDIA that's reviewing that OT report, they also won't make their own judgments. So if it's broken down, it's really clear and there's no ambiguity there. So then specifying any assistive technology and equipment, again, having a breakdown of what that should look like. If the person needs, a ceiling hoist, or they need a gantry hoist, or they need, it might be a Sarah Steady or a commode, whatever it is, all of those things should ideally be specified. Now, that doesn't actually have an impact on, what the staff and support would look like. But if a person requires specific equipment and they do not get funded for it, then that might then have an impact on how much support they need. If a person requires a ceiling hoist and a 1-to-1 staff ratio with that right equipment, that's really critical because them not getting the ceiling hoist might mean then that their support needs increase and it becomes 2-to-1 support as opposed to 1-to-1. So those things are absolutely critical. And then also, and we see this quite often, when a person is transitioning into a new home, quite often they might need increased supports. It might only be for the first few days. It might be for the first week or the first 3 months, depending on what their support needs are. During that transition period, if they're going to need any sort of increased support, then that needs to be articulated in the reports. So someone that typically needs an inactive sleepover, if they're moving into a new home, based on history or based on what their behaviors of concern are, if it's reasonable to assume that, they might have some disruption to their life, and so they might need some overnight support for an interim period, that should be clearly articulated by the OT. And it is okay to state that it is an estimation of, what that would look like, because it's impossible for us to, to predict, but we can look at history and we can look at incident reports. We can look at behaviors that have occurred in the past and can make a reasonable judgment as to what level of support the person needs. So, quite often we'll get OT reports that say, due to the history or due to the behaviors of concern, it's anticipated that for the first 6 weeks that the person moves into their new home, they will need an active sleepover as opposed to an active night support, as opposed to an inactive sleepover. Again, that's really, really critical. And that means then that we would reflect that, whether it's in our roster of care for the SIL submission or in the service cost estimate, and the information then aligns. And then lastly, just being able to detail what other multidisciplinary supports are needed. So if a person needs behavior support, then just articulating that they'll need the behavior support planner. If they need physiotherapy or they need speech pathology, if they need nursing supports in the community, all of those things, it's always really helpful if that's reflected in the OT report. Okay, so before I move on, any questions about what we've covered so far? Okay. All right, so now I just want to talk a little bit about On-Call's application and onboarding process. And it's really, really important to highlight. I think we've got a question. I can see that someone has their hand up. Melinda?
Yes. Oh, hi,
Kat. Question?
Hi, thank you for your time today. Yeah, I have a question. When we have someone in a SIL property and they are getting funding for, the rest of care, and also they will have to access the community. So as for their choice and control, how much choices do they have about, picking another provider for social community access, and who dictates that?
They have absolute choice over who provides their social and community participation. So it's always the participant's decision. If for any reason they can't make that decision, then it would be their nominee. So quite often, when I think about all of the participants that we currently support, a majority of those, we provide their SIL supports or their assistance with daily living. And then they actually have a different support provider coming in and doing that social and community participation with them. So it looks very different for each person. Most people have, your typical 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday to Friday social and community participation, where, as I said, they'll have a different agency come in and deliver that support. Or it might be on the weekends where, someone goes out to the footy every Friday night. So they've got 5 hours on Friday night of CP. Similarly, they identify a support provider and they will come in and deliver those supports. On-Call can absolutely provide that if that's the participant's choice, but there's no expectation that we would. And we absolutely encourage people to be able to use a different range of providers. So it means in that instance, we would only be the SIL provider. And then with their social and community participation, they will have someone else engaged.
Okay, because the reason I'm asking, I did have a experience with a SIL provider where they're not allowing external providers to come and support the participant for social community access, and they build that into their roster of care, and when they're requesting the SIL funding.
Okay, I would encourage you to challenge that, because to me that doesn't sound like it's choice and control at all.
No.
So if the participant or their nominee have made it very clear that they want that flexibility or they want someone else to provide that support, then a SIL provider cannot block that in any way. So if you're having that issue, then I would encourage you to either go back to them and request that it be reviewed, or, of course, any issues that you have with any provider, you can always go to the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission and lodge a complaint if you need to.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so so what you'll see there is our application and onboarding process. And there are, there are 9 general steps, and this is not in any way a fixed process. This is what typically the process will look like from start to end. However, really important to stress that, we assess applications on a case-by-case basis. So, at that first step, once someone submits an application, what the next steps look like for them might be very different. But this is really to give you a broad overview. And then in terms of what the timelines can be, from the moment a person submits an application to the point where they're able to move into a property and we start to deliver supports, that can also look very, very different. We've had processes that happen within 2 weeks. We've also had processes where it can take up to 6 months or even longer to be able to do that. So it's very, very different. And I guess I encourage you to take this with a grain of salt in terms of what the expectations are. So I'll run through just very briefly each of those so that you've got a bit of a sense of what that might look like. So the first step is submitting an application. Now, obviously that can be for either a specific property, or it can be submitting a general application for housing with Oncall. Now, if an application is for a specific property, usually that will happen via the listings that we have on the Housing Hub. And I would hope everyone in the room is familiar with the Housing Hub. So any vacancies that we have will always be listed there. And that will have, really detailed information about the property. And it'll also have a link to our application forms. So applications will come through that way, or it can be through our website as well, where similarly we'll have all the listings for any of the vacancies that we have. However, as I said, quite often, someone will come to us without a clear view, I guess, of what they're looking for. And it's really them saying, look, I need somewhere to live and I need Oncall to support me in that environment. And we then assess based on what they need. If a person applies for a property and for one reason or the other, it's not the right fit, or we don't have exactly what they need, then there's always the option to add them to the waiting list. So we maintain a priority waiting list, or alternatively, we might then link them in with an SDA provider. So one of our SDA provider partners, and that's where we would then start to look at that custom build that I was talking about. So depending on what their funding is, if they have SDA funding and we know what the building type is, what the location is, we can then explore with them and a custom build either for sole occupancy, or we would match them with other people that have similar funding, similar support needs, where there's a good match, and we would then work with the SDA provider to develop that property. So the second step there is doing the initial review. So once we've received the application, we then make contact with the person that's completed the application. Quite often it's the participant themselves, but sometimes it's a nominee or it's the support coordinator. It might be, oftentimes it's a social worker if a person is stuck in hospital. So we make that initial contact to get more information about the person, start to understand them a little bit more. That's the point where we'll organize to meet with them. Now, in a COVID environment, of course, that's not always face-to-face. So it might be a virtual meet where, we're introducing ourselves to them, but we also want to understand who the person is, observe what their needs are, all of those things. And that's where we would also start to request any other reports that are in place. So if a person has a behavior support plan, if they've got a speech pathology plan, all of those things. And we certainly start to dig deeper into the OT reports as well. We then start to look at matching and screening. So depending on what the person's needs are, what their preferences are, the funding that they have, the property that they're looking for, we then identify, so it's identifying a property, first of all. Now, if a person has come to us looking for the SIL only component and they've already got a property, then we don't have to go through that step. But more often than not, the person will need both the property and the staffing support. So we're doing the matching and screening for both the property, but also potentially other people that they'll be living with. So we might have a property identified where, you know, it's a 3-bedroom, it's a 3-person share. There are already 2 people living there, and then you have a vacancy. So we need to then do that matching to determine whether that's the right fit. And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So, you know, quite often it's really, really important that we have all of the information about the preferences, any behaviors, all of the support needs before we do that initial matching and screening. So once the property is identified, we'll then facilitate a property tour. Again, it's preferred that that's with the participants themselves and their nominee or the support coordinator, family, whoever it might be. But wherever possible, we absolutely want the participant to be part of that process. The reality is there are times where that can't happen, whether that's because the participant is stuck in hospital or because them coming and having a property tour might be so disruptive to them and it might be detrimental, in which case we'll look at other options. So we would typically then provide the tour to their nominee or their support coordinator. And, wherever possible, we'll try and do a bit of a virtual tour. So it might be just, taking some photos while the nominee is there. They might take their own video, but we also have virtual tours of most of our properties, so that if the person is not able to come in and, physically go through it, they've at least got access to that. And when we have the property tour is where we'll typically then answer any questions about the physical accommodation, and also talk to the person about any modifications that they might need, and what the funding is and how it aligns and all of those things. Because what's really important to remember is once we've identified the property, if it is suitable, after that point, it's very, very difficult to then make any other modifications to the property. And it's almost a, this is the property as it is, and it needs to either meet the needs or we need to find an alternative. So at that point, if the property is suitable, we would then organize a meet and greet with any other tenants that live there. If it's sole occupancy, then obviously that wouldn't apply. But quite often, if it's shared living, then would organize a meet and greet. Again, wherever possible, wanting that to be face-to-face, but sometimes that has to be virtually as well. And that meet and greet is so that the applicants can meet the people that live there, get to know them, see if it's a good fit, and vice versa. The people that live there need to meet the person that's potentially going to be living with them, and they have a chance to interact. Their families have a chance to interact, and that's usually a really, really good indication of whether that's a good fit or not. Now, we do know that, a 30-minute meet and greet does not necessarily tell you everything that you need to know about whether 2 or 3 or 4 people can live together, but it's a good starting point and it's a good indication. After that meet and greet, each person then has the opportunity to provide some feedback. Now that can be during the meet and greet itself, or it can be after, just so that there's also a little bit of confidentiality in terms of how that went. So then we have the application outcome. In terms of application outcomes, there are really three options that you would have. So either the first option is that a person's application has been successful, in which case we would move on to the offer and acceptance stage. The second option is that a suitable property hasn't been identified, or the property that was identified isn't suitable, in which case the person has the option to either withdraw their application, or again, we can add them to the wait list, because we constantly have new properties coming online, whether it's new builds as we're working with SDA providers, or if someone moves out of a property because they they're transitioning to aged care, or they found a more suitable option for them, then a vacancy comes up. So that's constantly changing, which is why we're always offering to add people to the wait list, because things do come up frequently. The third option would be that we're unable to offer services. Now that doesn't happen too often. However, there may be situations where, for one reason or the other, it's just not in the person's best interest for us to be able to offer services. Now that might be because the level of support that they need is more than what OnCall can reasonably offer, or it might be that the person, we know that the person's not going to get the funding that aligns with what they've applied for, or there might be other reasons. However, it is definitely one of the outcomes that's possible. So then once the person's application has been deemed successful, as I said, we would then make an offer at that point. So that is always going to be a conditional offer, because it's subject to the person getting the funding that they need. So that would be both if it's an SDA property, then it's both the SDA and the staff funding, so the SIL funding that they need to be able to live in there. Now, quite often by this point, the person will already have their SDA funding, so we already know that that's secured. But there are times where the person might have applied for a property while their SDA assessment is still sitting with the NDIA team, in which case we know what they're likely to get, but until that's actually finalized, we cannot move forward. So we provide a conditional offer, and that's the point where we then determine, whether we're going to be doing a roster of care and doing the SIL submissions, or we'll just be providing the service cost estimate. And this is typically the point where the support coordinator would then trigger that change of circumstance, so that the plan can be reviewed, the SIL submissions can be reviewed, all of those things are reviewed together so that the person can then receive the funding that they need in that new environment. Once the funding is secured, then we enter into all of those agreements that I talked about previously. So at that point, we then move on to an actual transition plan. So the property's been identified, funding's been secured. We know that all of these things have started to align, and now we need to look at an actual transition. So working with the participants and their supports to identify when they're going to be moving, what that needs to look like, and at that point is where we start to do things like develop the support documentation. So, you're developing the person's profile. We're working with the clinical care teams to develop any specific health management plans. If there's a behavior support plan in place, our behavior assessment team is working with their practitioner to make sure that, everything is uploaded onto the portal, all of those different things that need to happen. It's also where, probably most critically, we start to understand a person's preferences and what skills their staff would need, because we then develop a team specifically for them at that point. So, we have a pool of staff that work within our services, but then once a new participant comes on board, we tailor a team around them. So, if it's a sole occupancy property, then it's tailoring the team around them specifically. If it's in a property where they're sharing with others, similarly, the team has to understand and respond to their needs as well as the needs of everyone else in that house. So we build the team, they go through any training, any additional training that they need. All of our staff have, their minimum qualifications and they must meet certain requirements to work with on-call. However, we know that each participant has very different support needs. So a participant might need, for instance, catheter support. So not all the staff would be trained to catheter care specifically. It means that that team that we build around that person needs to then go through an added level of training to make sure that they can support that person. It might be that the participant has, some mental health support that they need. So then the staff would go through mental health training specifically for that person. Because even though they might have the experience and the minimum qualifications, we know that every person is very different. So all of those things happen during the transition plan, and it's very, very collaborative with the participants and their support teams. Usually if the person's coming out of a hospital environment, then that's quite a complex discharge where we're doing all the discharge planning and we're having the care teams with the social workers and the doctors and all of those components, and then implementing all of that. And the transition plan doesn't actually end when a person moves. So it's not a fixed timeline. It's very much dependent on each person, but transition is, support pre the move, support with the move itself, and then for a period of time after the person has moved to make sure that they've settled in well, to make sure that their support team is in place and everything's working as it should be. And also addressing anything that comes up after the fact. So then once that transition plan is implemented, then of course you've got the actual move itself, where, after this very long process, the person gets to move into their new home and on-call starts to deliver the supports within that. So in terms of the team, you'll have the team of support workers, and that team is led by a coordinator that's then led by a manager, and they're all part of that broader team where they're delivering the day-to-day supports, working with the person and their broader, it might be allied health practitioners, might be the GP, whoever it is. So ongoing, working with all of those people as needed to deliver the support they need. Okay, so lastly, I want to just very, very briefly go through our current vacancies. Before I do, I know that was a lot of information to process. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. So with vacancies, I think the really, really important take home with vacancies is that On-Call always publishes its vacancies on the Housing Hub and the website. And as I said before, that changes quite frequently. People come on board and then of course, people transition into aged care and things like that. So the vacancies are constantly evolving. And we're also, because we have so many projects in development with SDA providers, we have brand new properties coming online very frequently. So the Housing Hub and the website are absolutely valuable if you want to see what our vacancies are. We also send out monthly property listings that have that information. However, the really, really important takeaway is quite often someone might apply for housing with On-Call and, based on their support needs or their funding, there isn't a current vacancy that aligns with what they need. And that's absolutely fine. We still work with them to as I said before, either tailor something specifically to them, or it might be that we'll, again, we'll enter into a head lease for a property to match their needs. So we might do that, or we might actually work with the SDA provider to do the custom build for something brand new for them. So I guess what I'm trying to really highlight is, absolutely, access the vacancies. But if you don't find something that meets the participants' needs, then if you get in touch with us anyway, we will look at, okay, how can we support the person? And what does that need to look like? Are we going to tailor an option specifically for them? Are we going to provide some medium-term accommodation while, because we know that there's something coming up in 6 months? All of those things we can consider and we can explore. So the current vacancies is just one aspect of the way that we can provide support. So as I said, because these are on the Housing Hub and on the website, I won't drone on about them, but I really just wanted to show you a brief snapshot of some of what we've got available. So you can see here, we've got a high physical support apartments in Doncaster, and that's one that we typically use for MTA. And this goes back to that example I was talking about where, someone might need MTA, but the property needs to meet certain accessibility requirements, because if the person needs a ceiling hoist, or they need, they're in a bariatric wheelchair and they need a hospital bed, all of those things, it means that we can't just offer MTA anywhere. It has to be in an apartment that's actually high physical support. So we then also have, we've got a robust property in Cranbourne North. So that's a property where, it's individual studios under the same roof line. And then there are some shared spaces, really, really large backyard. These are all, dare I say it, and I'm not biased, beautiful properties where a lot of work goes into making sure that the property isn't just, it's not just your typical property on offer. It's about making sure that it's a beautiful environment that, any one of us would be happy to call home. So I won't go into all of them individually. What I will just highlight there is, you'll see there that there's a mix of both SDA and the different categories. And then there's also the non-SDA options. So these are some of the examples I was talking about where we've done a head lease and we have participants living there that we've leased the properties specifically for. And then of course, we've got vacancies within that. So if you're supporting a participant that has SDA funds and needs a specific design category and building type, we can look at that option. But if you're supporting a participant that's not eligible for SDA and it's really only the SIL support that they need, then a property like the one in Beaconsfield or Cranbourne, they are more suitable because the SDA is not required. So again, just some additional options there. And for the SDA providers, for the SDA properties, it's not listed here, but obviously that's with a range of different SDA providers. As I said, we work with a number, and who we refer, which SDA provider we refer a participant to depends very much on what they're applying for. What are their needs? Are they looking for property in a specific location? Are they looking for something that's custom built? Or all of those different things will help us determine who we link an SDA, who we link a participant with. Okay, so just lastly, I'm going to leave that there for a moment. Certainly any inquiries that you have, whether about anything that we've covered today, or if you've got inquiries about housing in general, if you want to apply for a property for a participant that you have in mind, those are our contact details there. That number is the same number for any on-call services that you need. So even if it's not housing, if you wanted to explore other options, then you can certainly do that through that number. And then of course, we've got the email address there for housing. If you do want us to add you to our mailing list for our Oncall Property listings, then please just shoot through an email and we can do that. And as we send those out typically at the end of each month, and that shows not just the current properties and current vacancies, but also what's coming up over the next 6 months. So it gives a really good indication and it helps with pre-planning and those sorts of things. That's the end of our presentation. So thank you so much to all of you for joining me. We will certainly send out some information after the session. And as I said, if you do have any questions after the fact, please feel free to either give me a call or send through an email. Thank you.